Hello and welcome to Stratcom Talks. My name is Olga Dragiļeva. I'm a journalist here in Riga, Latvia, and today's webinar is dedicated to China's levers of influence. Increasingly, there have been concerns on China exerting influence around the world, including Europe, and their levers. So today we will explore these areas, economic and technological. We will discuss how China uses economics and technology with a strategic communications focus. So we have two world-class experts for you today. They will give their presentations, and then you, the viewers, are encouraged and will be able to ask them any questions or give remarks on what has been said. So this can be done under the live stream in the comment section. We encourage you to do this during the discussion and during the presentations. I will forward these questions to our guests. They will answer them to the best of their ability. And I am very happy to present you with our first speaker, Matt Ferchen. He is the head of global China research at the Mercator Institute for China Studies. Matt Ferchen's research focuses on China's economic statecraft, China's Belt and Road Initiative as part of China developing country relations with Southeast Asia, Latin America and Africa, and on US-China relations. He specializes in connections between China's domestic and foreign political economy, the governance of China's informal economy, and the relationship between economic development and security in China's foreign policy. So, Matt, please, the floor is yours. We are happy to hear your presentation. And after that, and after our next speaker, we will have the discussion.
Great, thanks so much for having me. It's a real privilege to be here today also with Roger to discuss these important and exciting issues. So I'm going to focus my discussion points on China's economic influence, and I'm going to talk about different modes and measures and how we think about influence and economic influence in general, and then go through some specific examples as I do that. So just to give you a preview of where I'm headed with the discussion, first I'll talk a little bit about the idea of influence and the background to some of those discussions. Then I'll talk about some of the different kinds of what I think of as modes of influence, and then talk about some specific ways in which China's economic levers and interdependence give it opportunities to use influence or sometimes undermine that influence. And then I'll make a few conclusions about broader points that we can take away. Just to sort of highlight what a couple of those will be. First of all, that I think we need clear concepts and measures of what we mean by influence, and that will be the first part of what I talk about, and the measures will be the second part. This is still a really early stage, I think, for us in understanding both what we mean by influence broadly and how we measure it, specifically with reference to the economic issues that I'll be talking about. And then the second main takeaway is that contrary to, I think, conventional wisdom, there are many examples of China's weaknesses and vulnerabilities when it comes to influence, as there are strengths and points of leverage. So I'm going to try to point out some of those issues as well and why I think those are important for our listeners. So let me begin by just saying a few words of introduction and background, and I'll be very interested to hear both what our viewers think and also Roger on this. My sense is that the discussion around China and the concept of Chinese influence in using this terminology of influence and, for instance, influence operations is still relatively recent. And as an American and as someone who's been in discussions for the last 4 or 5 years of US-China relations, it struck me that there was a change in tone and also the sort of specific reference among US policymakers to the idea of Chinese influence operations that began around 2016 and then continued to pick up pace afterwards. So this generally corresponds to the beginning of the Trump administration in the United States. But there's something about 2016 that I think is an important turning point in our sort of focus on China and influence and influence operations in particular. And I think we can also see events in other countries, in particular in Australia, where there's been rising concern about influence and influence operations. A lot of this has to do with definitions, concerns about China's involvement in internal domestic politics in the same way that concerns about Russia's interference in the US 2016 elections appeared. So this is just to say that this is relatively recent. I think it is in the US context, and I think this has then also kind of set the background for some of the discussions in Europe. But as recent as some of these discussions are, there's a broader background, which is really goes back at least 20 years now to questions about China's rising wealth and how it was going to be able to convert that wealth into power. And I think that's a lot of what we're talking about when we discuss today, especially the economic aspects of China's influence. And that will be primarily what I'm going to focus on. So a lot of the discussions about China's influence and China's influence operations certainly surround issues of ideology and the role of the Chinese Communist Party and affecting domestic politics, and influence operations in a more kind of clandestine operation sort of way. That's not what I'm going to be focusing on, more specifically on economic issues. So let me get into that by way of first talking about modes of influence. And here I am taking my cue in part from Evelyn Goh, a Australian-based researcher who has done a lot to shape thinking about how we can more carefully understand the relationship between possible types of influence and how it actually takes place on the ground. So let me talk about 4 ways that we can think about modes of influence. The first of them is probably the most prototypical, but also hard to find. This is a case in which China or another country is able to get another country or business or international institution to act against its own stated interests. So this is basically getting a country through coercion or inducement to act other than it has stated that it wants to. So one example that we could give of this in theory would be for if Vietnam decided to change its position on its concerns about China's role in the South China Sea and simply sort of grants hegemony to China in the region. And this would be potentially the result of either economic coercion or inducement on China's part, but the kind of behavior, the kind of outcome that would show that a country has completely gone against its stated or understood interests. I have a few examples here: Australia, Italy, Norway, and the Philippines, where people may think to themselves, okay, is China being able right now to use its economic influence to get Australia there was a long-standing interest in Europe to sign this agreement, 7 years in negotiations, and China simply, in the end, pushed European decision makers in a direction they were already headed. This is one way of understanding this. Another would be the recently signed Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement in Southeast Asia. So a big free trade agreement in Southeast Asia, where China and a number of countries in the region signed a free trade agreement. Again, long-standing interest for countries to basically reduce trade barriers, do more trade. You can think of this as a sort of preference multiplication example, and another example would be potentially the 17+1 grouping in Central and Eastern Europe, where a number of countries were looking to sort of balance their Western focus in terms of economic interdependence and look more toward Asia and China. A third category would be soft power. So examples of where China is not necessarily looking to change behavior as much as it is willing to get countries to sort of recognize or to give credence to some of China's goals, to give China prestige, to enhance its public image, or to echo China's own messaging. So this is less necessarily about behavior than sort of giving China a boost to its soft power that it is so very concerned with. So examples of this would be the Belt and Road Initiative, countries that are willing to sign MOUs with China on the Belt and Road, to cooperate on development initiatives in general. And again, maybe the 17+1 in the European context is an example of this, where countries are willing to sign on to this agreement as much as anything as sort of a public relations signal. And then finally, and I think this is maybe the least understood and least discussed one, is what happens when there is something that I think of as reverse influence, or when China actually sees unwanted, unexpected outcomes or mistakes in its efforts to get other countries to move closer to China's positions, to do things that they don't necessarily want, to pursue free trade agreements, or to sign on to things like the BRI, or when there are efforts at Chinese trade, investment, or financial deals that go awry. And here examples would include the Serbia-Hungary railway deal that there was a lot of pomp and circumstance around that, but actually very little progress. The infamous case of Sri Lanka debt and the port there, and how that did not turn out according to the intentions either on the Sri Lankan side or the Chinese side, or most recently in the case of COVID diplomacy. So we see basically China's plans or efforts or strategies and their effort to use economic means to achieve political or geopolitical ends that do not turn out the way that China intended, and that may actually even undermine China's interests. I think this is a fourth category that is really important. Let me move on then to talk about what I think are some different types of economic influence. The first of these so I distinguish among trade, investment, and finance. So on trade, I think the key question here is concerns about interdependence, dependence, and supply chains. And just to show you a quick example from a colleague of mine at MERICS, who's done a recent study on Europe-China trade dependence. So one argument is simply that the greater a country's trade dependence on China, the more likely it is that China is going to be able to use some of these different levers of influence. So we see, for example, German commercial interest in signing the recent CAI agreement. So this is a fairly simplistic way of thinking about this, but certainly we can measure interdependence and dependence in terms of trade, and how that might give China certain levers of influence. Another example of trade influence comes from the ability to set standards. And again, all of these are the sort of areas where people are already starting to explore the ways in which China's influence operates and concerns that already exist. So free trade agreements, like again, the RCEP agreement that I just mentioned in Southeast Asia, China's creation of special economic zones, for instance, in Africa and elsewhere in Southeast Asia, and then in areas of technical standardization, something that I'm sure Roger will touch on a little bit. A second area that we can think of in terms of differentiating types of China's economic influence are in investment. And I think this is where a lot of the focus ends up coming at the end of the day, even though I think trade and finance are just as important in their own way. So investment, concerns, first of all, about China's own industrial and technical and technology policies and efforts to try to increase China's competitiveness through state support for innovation policies, so encapsulated often in the China 2025 program. Concerns about China's foreign investment, concerns about foreign investment into China, and again, this is where the preference multiplication comes from. So firms who have a presence in China want more access to the Chinese market. This gives China leverage. Again, this is potentially a really important way of understanding decisions surrounding the recently signed CAI agreement. But then we also have lots of concern about forced technology transfer when foreign European companies invest in China. And then lastly, concerns a different set of issues about Chinese investment into Europe or other places in the world. So this runs the range from infrastructure to mergers and acquisitions, supply chains, and then of course investment screening protocols, which we see being rolled out in the EU right now. So these are all different aspects of investment concerns. And then finally, finance. And this is an area, again, where I think maybe we don't appreciate enough the difference between investment and finance. Much of what I think in the media is referred to as investment is actually finance. And this matters because there's a difference in terms of who takes on risks. So much of China's Belt and Road behavior, its outbound flows of funds are actually through lending. And this then provides important sources of leverage for China, but also sometimes creates debt problems when China is unable to get its debt repaid. And we see this in different parts of the world, less so mostly in Europe, but certainly in the periphery in Europe, but also in places like in examples like the Hungary-Serbia railway line. And then finally, renminbi policy and financial leverage. This is an area where we certainly see the United States using its financial and economic leverage, and China, one of the reasons in the background for China's interest in sort of increasing the profile of its currency, the renminbi, is that so that it can use similar tools. But then there are also questions of US investment or investments from China in US and other treasuries and financial products, but also China's efforts to create financial centers and possibly to use cryptocurrency as a way around other countries' sources of leverage. I will just conclude then by saying that I think that there is a really important need to better understand what we mean when we talk about China's economic heft or its economic power, both in terms of concept and measures, and that we also need to understand weaknesses and unexpected outcomes as much as we need to understand China's strategic planning and strengths. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, and we have already some questions coming in, but I think I will forward them to you a bit later, once we have heard our second presentation of this webinar, and I'm happy to introduce now our second speaker, who is Rogier Creemers. He's a postdoctoral, oh, sorry, that was our previous information. Yes, but he's assistant professor now at the Institute, the Leiden Institute for Area Studies. His main research interests are the interaction between law, governance, and information technology in China, and Chinese political legal ideology. So, Dr. Creemers, the floor is yours, and I'm sorry again for misrepresenting you in the beginning.
Not at all, no worries. And indeed, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Following on from the very informative remarks by my colleague Matt, I would like to dive a little bit more into questions of information through media and technological means. And obviously the most important in that regard is foreign propaganda. Why does China do foreign propaganda, and how does it do it? In fact, the Chinese government has been, as Matt already suggested, trying to increase its soft power around the world for decades. The Chinese government has long felt that it is unfairly represented around the world, that it has an undeserved bad name and bad reputation, and that therefore it needs to counteract this through media. And once upon a time, that was mostly traditional media, by, for instance, printing China Daily and trying to get that into audiences all around the world, as well as television stations, but also, for instance, through education, funding Chinese language teaching, funding Confucius Institutes to spread more information about China's culture, and so on and so forth. Now, what is the role of this foreign propaganda? First and foremost, it is to create a more positive image of China among populations in target countries, in other words, influencing public opinion, and thereby then also influencing political opinion, so that governments in these countries will be more conducive to helping China realize its own interests. Obviously, that has now moved into the online sphere as well, where certainly during the corona pandemic, there has been very well publicized incidents of Chinese diplomats, official media voices, pushing particular lines on the virus in order to exculpate China, talk up the Chinese response to the virus, talk down the response in European countries or in the United States to the virus, and sowing doubt, in fact, about the origins of the virus, where we had a fairly well-known foreign ministry spokesperson, Zhao Lijian, pushing theories, amongst others, that the coronavirus was brought to China by members of the US military when the military games were organized there late in 2019. Now, obviously, one of the things that we very often see, particularly where we talk about technology and information, is that Chinese information efforts are very often equated to Russian information operations. And I think we have to be careful with making that equation. Russian information operations tend to be of a very different type, using different means, and indeed with different objectives. Russia, a country that has an economy about the size of Spain's, but has a nuclear arsenal and a historical chip on its shoulder, believes that its only way to survive in a world where it's surrounded by continent-sized competitors is to weaken those competitors. And so Russian disinformation operations are aimed at creating fear, uncertainty, and doubt within target countries about the health of their own socioeconomic and political systems. And obviously, in the United States, we see that these efforts have been fairly successful. But interestingly, very little, if none, of the disinformation that Russia spreads is about Russia. There is very little in there about, the glorious Russian culture. There is very little combined effort to teach Westerners the Russian language. This is not about creating a particular image, first and foremost, for the Russian states, Russian society, Russian culture in target populations. China, on the other hand, works through social media in a much more overt manner. It's obviously very difficult to prove that China isn't engaged in any international covert operations right now, and certainly there are indications that it has been starting to deploy techniques that are fairly similar to the Russian ones in Hong Kong, which, of course, very sensitively Beijing views as a domestic affair. But at least internationally, Chinese influence operations have been overt. It's very clear who is doing the speaking. It is very clear what they say. And the interesting thing is that if we are then going to evaluate whether these influence operations are successful, we need to come up with a benchmark of what success is. And certainly one benchmark has to be what's public opinion about China in countries targeted by Chinese social media activities. And the answer, according to Pew Research, to a Pew Research study that came out a couple of months ago, is not very good for the Chinese side. Negative perceptions about China have skyrocketed in Europe over the last year or so. Obviously, the coronavirus pandemic plays a major role in that, but also activities of Beijing in relation to Hong Kong, in relation to Xinjiang, most notably, concerns about Huawei presence in 5G networks, and so on and so forth. China's generally increasingly authoritarian style of governance hasn't necessarily done its image in Europe a lot of good. And so just on that very, very simple benchmark, it seems that Western states are fairly robust and resilient against potential Chinese influence through either traditional or social media. For instance, even in countries in Europe that are generally seen as more favorable towards China, like Spain and Italy, over 60% of people interviewed for this Pew study express a negative opinion about China. In other words, there are fairly sizable majorities who are very skeptical about greater integration with China, or indeed following China's lead. And when it comes to the leadership, there is not a single country where more than 27% of surveyed individuals expressed confidence in Xi Jinping to do the right thing. This picture is slightly more complex where one leaves, wealthy Western states. In Africa, for instance, the latest numbers that we have suggest that there's a really broad divergence between countries in their opinion about China. So in Guinea, Mali, and Burkina Faso, for instance, over 80% of respondents claim that China has been a positive influence of their country. But still, when asked which country would be the best model for their own country's development, the vast majority of surveyed Africans would still say the United States. So it is obviously very important to think about, particularly given the day and age that we live in, thinking through issues of fake news, thinking through questions of technology and political influence, which are very real at the moment. I think it's very important that we think well and intelligently about Chinese influences through media channels. But I think that at the same time, we should also not excessively fixate on it. Obviously, if you're a diplomat having to deal with Chinese counterparts, this is extremely irritating. It's extremely irritating if you're a French senior policymaker and the Chinese embassy in your country is posting articles about how people are left to die in the streets as part of France's so-called lackluster response to the coronavirus pandemic. It's extremely irritating. What it doesn't seem to be, however, is effective. And that means that I think a healthy response, at least in the media sphere, to this purported greater influence from China is to actually think through what it is that we could do here in Europe to make our societies more resilient in the first place against disinformation or influence operations, regardless of where they come from. And that doesn't even have to be necessarily China specific. But for instance, if we are worried about greater Chinese influence, for instance, in higher education, there's nothing stopping European governments from providing increased funding to higher education and research that they have progressively withdrawn over the past decades, leaving China to fill the gap. If we are concerned, for instance, about Chinese political messaging, particularly in the run-up to an election, there's nothing stopping governments from tightening campaign finance rules or electoral advertising rules that are in place already. I've generally found that European governments are behind the curve when it comes to equipping intelligence and security services with the regional knowledge and the language skills that they need to effectively engage with Chinese influence operations. And this is particularly important where, and this is something that I do think is important, these operations predominantly target Chinese ethnic communities resident in European countries. And these people need particular attention and need to be particularly protected in very many cases against undue influence from Chinese authorities, particularly where they are members of vulnerable ethnicities who may still have relatives, friends in China that might be used as leverage. In other words, this is not necessarily, as you know, the disinformation issue is, in my view, not necessarily the biggest problem that we should be worried about immediately. What I do think we should think much longer and harder on is how all of this fits in a long-term relationship that we want to build up with China. And this is the thought that I want to conclude with. The reality is that, you know, disinformation emerging, for instance, from Chinese diplomats is highly irritating. But generally that is because the relationship between China and the West has become increasingly fractious. And part of that has to do with the fact that I think we're coming to the end of a particular model of globalization for multiple reasons, not just reasons that have anything to do with China, and that we need to start thinking creatively about what our future is going to look like, and what that future is going to look like when we no longer have the comforting idea that China will sooner or later become a liberal, democratic, free market capitalist state just like us. We have to start thinking long and hard about the sort of global politics, the geopolitics that we need to develop when we are having to engage with a China that is still the most populous country in the world, well on its way of becoming the #1 economy in the world, a major supplier of goods that we all need, as well as a major purchaser of goods that we all need, yet a country that, from an ideological perspective, is very, very, very different from us. It seems to me that the least bad scenario in that respect is that we are looking forward to a fairly protracted period of deeply unsatisfactory compromise with a China that, on the one hand, we need urgently in tackling global issues, of which climate change is obviously the most important, but there are others. And at the same time, do not agree with on matters that we hold to be of fundamental importance to us as political, social, and economic principles. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, and you left us with quite a riddle there, and we do have some questions. I will maybe take this privilege of being the moderator, so that I can ask you first. And I was wondering, so if we look at China's influence in terms of strategic communications, and with a strategic communications focus, what do you think? How could you maybe define their China's overall aim? Because, as you have pointed out, and the question is to both of our speakers, but maybe Rogier would like to answer this first. You have defined that, yes, the populations of, for instance, some of the European Union countries, they are not their opinion of China is not very high, but maybe this is not the aim. Maybe the aim is to somehow influence the opinion makers or politicians or those taking decisions on some sort of statements in the UN, etc. So what is the overall aim in terms of strategic communications? What do you think?
The overall aim of Chinese strategic communications, I believe, always has to be sought in the domestic development agenda. From the Chinese perspective, whatever happens in the international space is essentially an extension of the domestic problems that it needs to be solved. And so those domestic problems can range from maintaining investment inflows into China, maintaining access to particular resources, but also, for instance, maintaining markets for those Chinese products that China believes to be essential to its future growth and development trajectory. And perhaps the clearest example that we have of that in recent years has been Huawei. The extent to which the Chinese government has spent political capital at trying to ensure, maintain, expand Huawei's access into foreign telecommunication markets is very, very big. And obviously that also plays to generally persuading on the one hand the general population, but on the other hand, as you say, policymakers, but also economic decision makers, business people, of the fact that the Chinese approach aligns with their interest. In other words, it's very much persuading. In fact, one of the reasons that it very often doesn't really work very well is that China tends to be very, very much in send mode. We have this idea, we have this approach, we think it's fantastic, you should take it over. What China doesn't do very well is create openness for potential partner countries to get some ownership of that discourse, to get some ownership of that thing. So it's very much, it's a Beijing-centric approach aimed at solving domestic problems and creating an international environment that is conducive to that.
Matt, do you have anything to add?
I think that's right. The couple of things that I would sort of add to it are that I think that we can distinguish in terms of what China wants in broadly different regions. On the one hand, we can think of China's engagement with what it categorizes as the developing world, going back all the way to the 1950s. China has pursued an effort to be seen as a leader and a model for countries in Asia, Africa, and to an extent Latin America. That's morphed over time in terms of the message being sent. Used to be more revolutionary, sort of anti-imperialist, and since at least the turn of the millennium has been much more focused on development. But that's sort of how we can understand what's going on with the BR, and I completely agree with Roger that has a lot to do with domestic understandings in China about what will sell well abroad in terms of a message of this is good for us, it's good for you, this will be great for everyone, when often those are really in China's interests. And then to distinguish that from the approach that China takes with wealthier countries in Europe and North America in terms of what it wants in markets, but also in fending off pressure from the US or Europe on values, human rights, and governance systems, and trying to defend that, but also trying to give a message and trying to reduce threat perceptions to sort of keep a defensive perimeter for China. So it really depends on where we're looking, and they adapt their messaging and sort of what they want depending on where we look.
Thank you. So I will go to some questions that we have here, and one of them continues the question of China's propaganda within Western media, and the question is: to what extent is China's more overt propaganda within Western media intended for the country's domestic audience and wider diaspora? So that kind of continues our conversation.
I think there's a really interesting element to which, I mean, obviously, the vast majority of Chinese people speaks better Chinese than English. So I don't think that they really are the target consumers of foreign-oriented propaganda, which very often comes in English or other language that aren't Mandarin. But there is a very interesting audience perspective there, where one of the things that I found when I did a study on the television part of the foreign propaganda bureaucracy is they report their numbers, they report their achievements in terms of output and production, not in terms of audience. So they will say, like, we distributed so many copies of the China Daily, or we broadcast this many hours of broadcast content. But it says nothing about reception, it says nothing about effect or impact. So the audience to which many of these people who are running these things in Beijing are speaking are the people above them in the bureaucracy who at some point will promote them. So they want to make sure that they do the right things that will get them promoted. And the actual impact of their messaging seems to be secondary to that in the way that that accounting works within the system. And then why the Chinese diaspora community? Well, a lot of it has to do with this sort of notion that we very often use these trite and cliched things about how China is really a civilization. It's not a country, and very often that leads to very dubious culturally essentialist elements. But there is a case to which the Chinese government does seek to present itself as the political lodestar of people of ethnic Chinese origin, regardless of where they come from. And obviously, again, in terms of its impact, it's really difficult to draw one line here. You have Chinese communities in Europe who came over in the late 19th or early 20th century, and who have very little contact with the mainland. But you also have a lot of first-generation migrants, or indeed Chinese people who are working or studying here, who have that very close relationship.
I would just jump in here real quick on this, because I think that my example of sort of when there are examples when China has undermined its influence, including through economic efforts, and if you look at Southeast Asia, but other regions, a lot of the sort of economic diplomacy efforts sometimes go through or are targeted at overseas Chinese communities, or there is a sense that they can work through those networks. But those communities are also part of very volatile domestic politics in a number of countries in Southeast Asia. So to the extent that the Chinese central government, which has been doing more of recently, tries to activate those communities on behalf of PRC interests, they're playing with fire. And we're seeing some of this backlash, although we don't see it reported all that much in places in Southeast Asia.
Thank you for your remarks, and I would like to add maybe one thing to what Roger has said, is that in your remarks you could see the parallel between China and Russia here, because both of these aspects, the bureaucracy of propaganda and the aim to cover vast audiences is very similar to what Russia is doing. Russia today does not reach a lot of people's hearts and minds maybe, but it does reach a lot of audiences. So you could find some similarities there, I guess. I don't know if you agree, but that could be seen. We are having a lot of questions here. There's not much time left, but I would like to maybe divert our conversation to slightly different route, and we have here finally an economics related question, which I will read to you now. So how can we mitigate the risk linked with our heavy dependence on Chinese tech hardware and components of Western supply chains? Again, you can choose who will answer this first, but very interesting question.
Roger, I think you should start on this one.
I think that's going to take a very long time. Technological decoupling is, if you want to draw a parallel with another political event that is so fairly close to home, it's Brexit. And what we're seeing with Brexit is that it turns out that if you allow a border-spanning ecosystem to develop for decades, you can't simply rip it apart without causing potentially a tremendous amount of damage, but certainly also then suddenly discovering how complex that ecosystem has become, that has developed over time. So when we look at technology decoupling, for starters, it's going to be, really, really difficult and expensive. China is pretty much the only place in the world where you can produce electronic devices at the volume that we do today, with the quality that we do today, and at the price we do today. So if, say, you want to move the assembly of iPhones away from China and to wherever else in the world, that's going to be hugely expensive. And as my builder who's helping me renovate my house says, you can do anything you like as long as you can afford it. That decoupling isn't impossible, but it's going to be hugely burdensome. And I would then like at least a little bit more honesty from our politicians in the West to level with their electorates and say, good, we believe it's strategically better to decouple from China, but it's going to come at a cost. Because I'm not sure how much of the population presently would be behind it if it were to add, say, 100, 200, 300 euros to the price of a smartphone. The other element to decoupling is, we talk a lot about brands and, is Huawei closely associated with the Chinese government and so on and so forth. There may be very legitimate security concerns for keeping Huawei out of networks. There are also reasons that we don't necessarily like to talk as much about. It would be much more difficult for, say, Five Eyes signals intelligence services to continue their highly sophisticated signals gathering that they do today on Huawei infrastructure. Obviously, that's something we'd like to mention a little bit less. But there, if I were the head of a Chinese intelligence service and I were to, say, infiltrate a value chain and put hardware backdoors, as long as Nokia or Ericsson gear is manufactured in China, that's what I try to target. I think we've come to the point where we think about these things in very simplistic, almost Fu Manchu type threat perceptions of the evil Chinese government trying to do these things. What we very often forget is that there are other ways of thinking about this. First and foremost, with all the scrutiny that Huawei has had where it comes to 5G, the moment that there is a single news report, that there is a single plausible report that Huawei is indeed in the pocket of Beijing where it comes to intelligence and data gathering, that's the end of that company. So that's a very big risk to run. The second element is, it's also a scenario to think through. As long as Huawei has a stake in access to international markets, it may act as a conduit to Beijing to send signals about what it might want to consider doing or not doing in order to allow Huawei to continue doing that. If you decouple too much, you risk losing those secondary lines of communication and influence that we might have in Beijing as well, right? We also need to think about what influence do we have or might we have in Beijing. And I'm not saying that those are arguments that mean that Huawei must retain full access to the European 5G landscape, but I do think that we owe it to ourselves to take them seriously in the discussion.
I would just jump in on one aspect of this, if I can, which is that there's a lot of discussion about coalition creation, especially in a transatlantic setting, on some of these issues of dealing with supply chain security and broader questions of what we're talking about with decoupling. And I think if there's anything that we've seen with the whole 5G Huawei issue, is that these questions are political as much as they are technical. And there is no just some simple technical fix that isn't also where there's political agreement about what constitutes a critical technology or a security threat or a sensitive piece of infrastructure. And I think what we sort of see that playing out in the way that member states are putting in place their investment screening protocols. But I think it's really going to impact this whole broader issue where maybe with the new Biden administration, there's a sense that there will be much more room for cooperation between the United States and the EU and maybe the UK on these questions of supply chain resilience and where to go on tech decoupling in general. But unless we sort of confront the fact that many of the decisions are as political as they are technical, it's going to be really difficult to create any kind of like-minded behavior that actually creates the kind of resilience and sort of shores up security in a way that will actually be satisfying.
And if I might add one short remark to that, particularly given that we are at a NATO talk today, I think we also have to bear in mind how, not just decoupling has become politicized, but indeed many other issues have. And certainly the recent experience that the EU has had with governments both in Washington and London, I think we should be realistic about the level of damage in trust that has resulted in. And, we're obviously getting a new administration in Washington next week. We are not due for elections in Britain for, nearly 4 years. So this is, the Tory government is what we're going to have to deal with there from the European perspective. But I think there will be quite some hesitation in some European capitals to hitch their wagon too closely, particularly to a Washington where, we're not quite sure whether what we've got is a durable reversion to a reliable alliance or a 4-year reprieve before we get a next wave of another, perhaps slightly more competent Trump emulating Republican administration, in which case all bets are off again. And in the meantime, what Europe has to realize is that it is actually extremely reliant on foreign technology. So what will be at the back of Europe's mind is that, it may well at some point need to find a middle ground between Washington and Beijing for its own technology supplies. That's something that, if we can't get back to really rebuilding that trust that, whatever agreement can be reached with the Biden administration, for instance, is going to persist after the 2022 midterms or the 2024 presidential elections, European governments are going to hedge.
Our viewers are also picking up on the question of the new administration in Washington, and we have one of our viewers asking, I quote, which could be the Chinese approaches to the new Biden's administration, and will they try to maintain influence actions in South Asia and Africa as now?
Well, I'll take a first stab at this. I think that there were sort of short-term, long-term considerations prior to the election results. There was a sense among some in China that the Trump administration, a second Trump administration, would continue or accelerate American decline in various ways, including removing it from international leadership on climate, on security, on trade, on everything, and that the Biden administration may be sort of would change U.S. policy on some of those things, and maybe present a more difficult challenge for China. But the longer term trend is that there is a sense of American decline in various ways that really started maybe at least from the financial crisis, that the COVID crisis has accelerated, and this has left China both sort of room for maneuver, but also left it in a precarious situation as the US lashes out in various ways. So there is a general rethinking that's been underway in China in terms of economic interdependence, all of this thinking about how to manage the benefits and risks of economic interdependence for China with its neighbors, with Europe, with the United States, that's been under active consideration. There is a sense that China needs to shore up its alignments. And I think that generally kind of corresponds with its relations, like kind of BRI, developing country relations. So we see Wang Yi, the foreign minister, on a trip to Africa, a new development policy from the Chinese government that just came out on Sunday. I think all of that sort of feeds into a sense that China is trying to shore up, including through economic means, who its friends are, who its sort of trusted circle can be in terms of interdependence. That's how I sort of also interpret the RCEP agreement, and then other kind of defensive measures, giving a little bit to the European Union on the CAI agreement. So I think a lot of that is, so some of that's more proactive or offensive, trying to create groups of like-minded or lower risk types of interdependency for China, again, sort of broadly corresponding with developing countries. And trying to mitigate the risks that come with potential more backlash, more of an effort on the U.S. side to create coalitions lining up to pressure China on areas of concern, say, shared between the United States and Europe.
Where it comes to the question of influence, I also think we really have to think about what influence really is and what it means, and what is an influence operation. I mean, this is a word that we like to use, but I think we very often use it vaguely. Certainly, in a lot of media and diplomatic sort of strategic communication, the influence doesn't seem to be directed at the ostensible targets, but at the people who hold. Who are gatekeepers for promotion for the officials in charge. There's also a thing, I've always been really skeptical about the notion of soft power, where, it's, when you look at the United States, it's not because in Europe we like watching The Simpsons or The Big Bang Theory that we necessarily go along with American foreign policy in Afghanistan and Iraq, right? These power is not a sort of bank account that you can have different sorts of power that you can allocate between different targets. Rather, the question is, and particularly if we're thinking from the form of strategic communications, it seems to me that the question is, what is it that China is going to try and communicate, and how do we respond to that particular messaging, either with regard to communication that is directed at us and is trying to persuade audiences in Europe, or communication that is aimed at third countries, third regions, and that we need to compete with. And if I can start with the second, certainly, from the Chinese perspective, China isn't evangelical in its model in the way that Western democracies have been. China couldn't care less how the president is appointed in whatever African or Latin American country that you care to name. They're not about exporting the Chinese model. What they are about is using the Chinese model as a way to ensure that, say, those countries in Africa who are willing to emulate China's example can then provide it with, for instance, the resources that it needs, the markets that it needs, and so on and so forth. So I think we need to be really careful in not assigning to China a motive that it doesn't have. There isn't a symmetry there. China isn't working, for instance, towards regime change in any country, or indeed, what we sometimes get in the technological sphere. China doesn't really have any sort of agenda for spreading its own political model. However, where it comes to the future, and particularly with regard to the United States, China does believe that, and certainly this is a very hawkish view in Beijing that has become mainstream certainly over the last 4 years, is that the United States, sooner or later, like any declining hegemon, will try and do whatever it can to stop China from achieving its glorious rejuvenation, as Beijing would call it. And so at this point in time, China is still inferior in terms of power and capability to the United States. And so it needs to, on the one hand, rapidly accelerate its efforts to either gain parity in some areas or gain some sort of asymmetric advantage in other areas, whilst at the same time, it will see the relative calm of the Biden administration as something that gives it a little bit more breathing room to prepare itself for that future. I don't think there are many people in Beijing who assign very benevolent intentions to the Biden administration. At the same time, and also very important where I think it comes to strategic communications, is that one thing that China will prefer to see is a decrease of volatility in international relations. This is, for instance, one reason why it has generally been very hesitant to deploy the sort of covert operations that we've seen Russia do, the real fear, uncertainty, and doubt operations, and that's because they have a lot of unforeseen consequences, and they result in volatility. And if there's anything that this very control-oriented Chinese government doesn't like, it's surprises. And so it will communicate in such a way that surprise is avoided.
Thank you so much. This is all we have time for. Unfortunately, this hour discussing China's influence has passed very quickly indeed, and I would like to thank our guests for very interesting inputs and extremely interesting presentations. I think a lot of maybe myths and some misconceptions have been debunked, and we have really learned quite a lot. So Rogier Creemers and Matt Ferchen, thank you very much to both of you, and this concludes our seminar today. Thank you to our audience as well. The only thing I have left to say is that next installment of Stratcom Talks is taking place next Wednesday on January 20th, and it will be about fact-checking and debunking. So same time, same place, and a new topic in a week. Thank you to our speakers, and thank you to you, our audience, again. Goodbye.